going to be comparing the Macbeth franchise to the Captain America franchise. There's definitely a big difference between these two franchises. I'm, of course, more familiar with the Captain America franchise. Now, yes, I did talk about the MCU in a different video, which means I have talked about some of these Captain America movies before, but you also have three actually that are older, that are separate from the MCU, that came out back in the 90s. You have this movie from 1990 that is well known for not being very good. Then you have a movie from 1979 and a sequel to that one, which actually have surprisingly good Rotten Tomatoes scores. They're both certified fresh, which is not what I was expecting, to be honest. Now, as I talked about in my video discussing Hamlet and Romeo and Juliet, I have nostalgia for William Shakespeare because I read some of his plays back in school. I don't remember specifically reading Macbeth. Now, when it comes to the highest score for each franchise, in the case of Macbeth, this movie called Macbeth, that's spelled Maqbool, which is a foreign film, has a 100%. The case of Captain America, the movie Winter Soldier, has a 90%. Then when you look at average score, this one is incredibly close because Macbeth has an average of 71.3, Captain America average of 71. So by literally only 0.3, Macbeth wins. When you look at lowest score for Macbeth, this movie called Joe Macbeth only has a 20%. The case of Captain America, the 1990 movie, only has a 12%. Macbeth wins here. Then when you look at average, then when you look at actually gap between lowest and highest score, you have a gap of 78 in the case of Captain America, have a gap of 80 in the case of Macbeth. So Captain America wins this round, but Macbeth already won 3 rounds, so it's going to win regardless of my personal opinion. But let's look at it now, and it should be pretty obvious which franchise I'm going to pick. Captain America, of course. Now, when I look at the free MCU standalone Captain America movies, I think that First Avenger is not as strong as Winter Soldier or Civil War. A lot of people would agree with that. But that doesn't make the movie bad by any means. I'd say it's still a good movie, just has more flaws compared to the other two. It's more uneven because I really like the first hour, Captain America's origin. I think that Steve Rogers is such an inspiring character because he's intended to be that paragon figure that we look up to, because he's such a fundamentally good person at his core. And we see throughout his time in the MCU that while Captain America is not completely stagnant, there is growth on his part. The core or essence of who Steve is never changes. He's a person who has a very strong sense of right and wrong and moral compass, and thus he doesn't have as overt of flaws as Tony Stark. Not that Steve is entirely devoid of flaws, but with Tony, they're more obvious in your face, whereas with Steve, it's definitely more subtle. Now, the part in Captain America the First Avenger where we see Steve defy orders in order to rescue all these soldiers, then he returns back to base with all the soldiers, that's a great moment. It has such a feeling of victory to it. You're like, yes, Steve did it. It's so satisfying. I think the score from Alan Silvestri here is actually really good. I like Peggy Carter as a character. I like the fact that unlike with, say, Pepper and Tony or Thor and Jane, Peggy and Steve never really get together. They don't actually go out on a date. There's feelings that they have for each other. There's a spark there, to be sure, but it's more tragic. On an emotional level, the ending to this movie does absolutely work. I mean, Haley Atwell and Chris Evans both give great performances, so it hits hard, especially when Steve says, "I had a date." It's a simple line, but it hits so hard. And you gotta think here, the last superhero role that Chris Evans had was Johnny Storm, aka Human Torch. Johnny Storm is obviously a very different character than Steve Rogers. He's obviously more of a flawed person than Steve is. He doesn't have that same noble, heroic, virtuous nature that Steve Rogers has. That's the thing that makes Steve so refreshing, is that he is a truly noble person who is so pure of heart. He doesn't at all desire power, domination, or control over others. That's really uplifting. But, however, when you look at First Avenger, Red Skull is not that good of a villain. Don't get me wrong, Hugo Weaving does a good job of the performance, but the material he's given to work with is just not that good, because Red Skull is just constantly delivering exposition. So whenever the movie cuts away from Steve and everything that's going on with him to Red Skull, I always am feeling like the movie is being dragged to a halt when you have Red Skull giving all this exposition about the cube, talking about wanting power. He's just a one-dimensional, evil for the sake of being evil, mustache-twirling villain. And also, the movie montages through World War II. And when you get to the end, okay, on an emotional level, it works, but logically, you're thinking, wait a minute, why does Steve actually need to go down with the plane? You literally showed us not long ago there are these little planes inside of the big plane. Why can't Steve use one of those? Why can't he find a parachute and get out of there before the big plane goes into the ice? You can just feel that filmmakers know they need to get Steve in the ice so he can be in the Avengers, but they didn't really come up with a good enough reason as to why Steve needed to go down into the water. Yes, it is powerful that Steve is willing to make this heroic sacrifice for the good of others, but you're just thinking, why can't Steve get out of there? It seems like there's ways he absolutely could do that. When I think about Captain America the Winter Soldier, I think it's a great movie. Sure, you have Nick Fury supposedly being killed and then coming back. You go, okay, that feels cliched. Once again in a Marvel movie, a character's not really dead. And yeah, when you get to the third act and you suddenly have these big helicarriers or heroes trying to take them out, it's not a badly done scene, to be clear, but you can't help but get this feeling, oh, okay, it's another Marvel movie that has a big spectacle third act where there's all these explosions. Can't help but feel a bit familiar, but the story here is really well done. The acting is great. The score is memorable. The practical hand-to-hand fight choreography is really well done and stands out. When I think about Captain America Civil War, it's a great movie. Does Zemo's plan really make sense if you stop and think about it? Not necessarily. There's certainly holes you could poke in it. I will say that you do feel like, wait a minute, do we really need Zemo? There was already tension in the team. The team was already breaking apart without Zemo having to do anything. So do we really need this character pulling all these strings? Feels like the conflict could have happened without Zemo doing anything. But I think it's refreshing that Zemo's an ordinary person without any powers. The airport battle is, of course, a ton of fun. The third act really hits hard, and Steve and Tony fight each other. The conflict here feels believable. You totally get where Steve is coming from, but you also get where Tony is coming from. So it doesn't feel forced. It doesn't feel contrived. And I think, man, Civil War does this so much better than Batman v Superman did. Overall, I'm a fan of the MCU Captain America movies, to be sure. I have not seen the non-MCU Captain America movies, but even though Macbeth is going to win this debate, I would personally easily choose Captain America. I'll wrap things up for this one.